A lot of people weren't happy with the last video that I made, and that was because I never used the AN94 for the way it was initially intended, i.e. burst fire mode. So after listening to the feedback, I've decided to remake the video and only test the burst fire mode rather than full auto. So like last time, use the annotations below to skip directly to the part of the video that you want to watch. So on its own, the AN94 is quite a unique weapon. Rather than most burst fire weapons, this weapon uses a 2-round burst rather than the traditional 3-round burst. The idea behind this was to enable the shooter to plant 2 rounds on the same spot, almost instantaneously. Think of this as kind of a built-in double tap. The AN94 is the only weapon in the game to actually use the 2-round bursts, making this very effective at longer ranges. Although it's still capable of holding its own in close quarters, you'll need to be careful as there's a lot of vertical recoil if fired in full auto, as seen in my previous video. If you find yourself in close quarters, I found it's actually better to use the burst fire mode and click quickly rather than holding down the trigger on full auto mode. The foregrip is mainly used to reduce the horizontal sway when firing the weapon it's fitted to. This is based on a per weapon value rather than a single global value. It would only really benefit certain weapons with a larger amount of side sway, like the FAMAS or the AEK-971. The AN94 seems to have very little side recoil as it is, plus it would only really be useful if you happen to fire in full auto like I did in my last video. In fact, using the foregrip altogether when firing in burst fire mode doesn't really seem to make any significant difference to the handling. Again, this is due to the AN94 having very little side recoil and that the foregrip doesn't really seem to modify the weapon's spread at all. Chances are you'll be firing the AN94 carefully while aiming down the sights, so using the foregrip may or may not be any use to you. But with a recent patch, a small long range accuracy penalty was added, which obviously hurts the overall performance of this weapon. Of course, this depends on how you play and it's mainly down to personal preference if you want to use the foregrip or not. Personally, I see the foregrip as the staple attachment for any weapon that's usually fired full auto at close range, like SMGs for example. But for burst weapons such as this, not so much, as there doesn't seem to be any real gain when using the foregrip. However, it's always handy to have and you never really know what to expect unless you've already been peppered a few times by someone using a shotgun. But you can still effectively kill people at close range with the AN94. If you do find yourself in this position, you can just click quickly or pull the trigger quickly if you're on the consoles. You're probably more accurate that way instead of holding down the trigger in full auto. And you also do more damage due to the rate of fire being about double when firing burst fire mode rather than full auto. All it really takes is maybe 1 or 2 quick bursts to the upper body or the head and it usually kills most people. You'll often see the foregrip being used with another attachment like the laser sight, the suppressor, the flash suppressor, or of course the heavy barrel. When used with the heavy barrel, the side recoil or the sway remains mainly the same, but the recoil, or the vertical recoil sorry, will be increased if you don't take your time when firing. It might be a little odd using an attachment suited to close range with one that's suited at longer ranges. The foregrip with the laser sight will reduce the weapon spread. Well, the laser sight will reduce the spread. The foregrip didn't really seem to do anything from the tests, although it's still good to use the laser sight for close ranges. The foregrip with the suppressor seemed to have slightly increased spread but also lower recoil. Although the suppressor no longer reduces the maximum damage, it still decreases the bullet speed, causing your shots to drop sooner. This could be an issue for those firing at close range. Again, like the suppressor, the flash suppressor seemed to reduce the vertical recoil more than the suppressor itself, but it reduced the spread slightly. The bipod, which is normally associated with light machine guns or sniper rifles, can also be used in some carbines or assault rifles. Although it might seem a bit strange to put a bipod on an assault rifle or a carbine, as chances are you'll be moving about a lot. But being at the right place at the right time with the bipod can prove extremely effective, especially when used around choke points or at longer ranges. So some forward planning may be required. It will also help immensely if you can effectively read your enemy's movements, or even if you have a teammate call out their positions for you. Using a weapon with the bipod can prove tricky, however, due to the restricted movement or the deployment-undeployment time that you need to take into account. I've also found that sometimes the bipod will bug out, like it might deploy randomly when aiming down the sights when looking over an obstacle. Sometimes it doesn't even deploy at all, although the accidental deployment issue may be my own fault, which it probably is. It should also be noted that it now doesn't matter if you use the sights or not when firing using the bipod. The accuracy is the same according to the latest patch. Although most people might use the sights anyway, as you enter the sights automatically as you set up. The bipod itself grants the user reduced recoil, especially when used with an assault rifle or a carbine, again thanks to the latest patch. Plus the deployment speed's been increased for all weapons, which makes sense if you plan on moving about, as you might need to reload sooner if you're not using an LMG, that is. Due to the long range nature of the AN-97, it seems that the bipod would be an ideal attachment for players that prefer to fight mid to long range. It's also quite common to see snipers use the bipod as well, and on some occasions they might actually take part in the fight. Luckily, coupled with the burst fire, the accuracy and the recoil reduction bonus of the bipod, this turns the AN-94 into an effective counter sniper weapon. Again, like the Foregrip, the player can also use the heavy barrel, the laser sight, the suppressor or the flash suppressor with the bipod, some prove more effective than others of course, though the bipod will reduce the recoil and spread considerably on its own. Using the heavy barrel with the bipod will reduce the spread and the recoil if you take your time when firing. This combo truly shines at longer ranges when using burst fire. With the laser sight, the spread is reduced greatly even when firing carelessly, but at ranges the laser sight loses its effectiveness and quickly becomes a weakness as it gives your position away. When used with the suppressor, the recoil is reduced slightly, and the bipod compensates for the increased spread penalty. But if you still have to worry about the reduced range issue if you're further away, that is. Again, the flash suppressor is very much like the suppressor with the further increased recoil reduction, although the spread seemed to increase as I got further away.
Objective is neutralized.
The flash suppressor used to be a gimmick. Before the patch there really was no reason to use it other than for only hiding the muzzle flash at the cost of aimed and automatic weapon accuracy. No one really saw the point in using this when the regular suppressor did everything the flash suppressor could do and more. For this reason the flash suppressor wasn't included in previous videos, but now since the patch in March, DICE gave the flash suppressor a little buff. The patch removed the aimed accuracy penalty and it now acts as a recoil compensator, but reduces recoil much better than the regular sound suppressor. The hipfire penalty still exists and is now based on a weapon specific value, but it doesn't seem to reduce the hipfire accuracy of the AN-94 by a terrible amount. Though the spread is slightly larger when using the flash suppressor, you're still able to hit things very consistently using the burst fire or when firing from the hip. The recoil is reduced slightly, which would help a lot for those longer range shots with the burst fire of the AN-94. Other than hiding the muzzle flash and lowering recoil slightly, the flash suppressor doesn't really do a lot for the AN-94, so many people seem to give it a miss. The flash suppressor can be combined with either the bipod or the foregrip. When used with the AN-94, this flash suppressor reduces the vertical recoil by a small amount, which helps at longer ranges, but it also increases the weapon's spread at the same time. It may not be that much of a big deal because when using the AN-94 with the burst fire mode, that is, or single shot, then you wouldn't really notice this, but if you were firing full auto then it might become more apparent. The heavy barrel is the ideal attachment for burst fire weapons due to the vertical recoil reduction and the aimed accuracy bonus. As expected, there's a small hipfire penalty to be aware of. This shouldn't really be an issue if you fire in controlled bursts or in single shots. When using this attachment with the AN-94, I found that I was able to hit things much farther away which wouldn't have been possible due to recoil. Another interesting thing about the heavy barrel is that it now increases the range of the weapon that's using it. Because of this I was able to shoot people from across the map with the recoil reduction of the heavy barrel. My shots were landing in almost the same spot every time. The improvement was quite surprising actually. However, it should be noted that the recoil bonus would only count if you don't fire too quickly, as doing so will add a considerable amount of unwanted vertical recoil. Also learned the hard way that you should never fire the AN-94 in full auto when using the heavy barrel. But really the worst thing you can do when using this attachment is to panic when firing or fire too quickly. Your chances of hitting anything will literally go down the drain. The heavy barrel is probably the best attachment for the AN-94 if used properly, and it truly is a lethal combination. Just put a scope on it, sit back, and you have yourself an assault sniper rifle capable of headshotting a guy from a few hundred meters away. The key thing to remember when using the heavy barrel is really just take your time when firing, or like use the burst fire mode or the single shot, and just kind of like wait for the recoil to settle on its own before taking your other shot. Another attachment that you could add with the heavy barrel is probably the Bipod. If you set up in a good kind of defended, secluded area, you could snipe people from across the map, as the accuracy is just insane. The laser sight is more commonly seen on the weapons that are used at closer ranges due to the hip fire accuracy increase. It does make a considerable difference from when firing from the hip, and it's also used to dazzle people just like the flashlight. But this feature can be used against you, as it will give away your position if you aren't careful. For this reason, the laser sight isn't really used in the longer range weapons, plus it's not like you're going to fire from the hip at that range anyway. But that's not to say that it shouldn't be used with the AN-94, as people will choose to play differently from others. You can still run around using the laser sight using the burst fire mode of the rifle while still firing from the hip and hit things at close range. Coupled with the accuracy of the burst fire mode and being able to dazzle people, you could fight a way out of a sticky situation with the AN-94 if you do get ambushed. But if you plan on sitting further back, then I would suggest getting another attachment, as the laser sight serves no other purpose at range other than blinding people. Also seems to have absolutely no effect on the recoil of the weapon from testing, and it also gives away your position as mentioned before. But this may be the deal breaker if you plan to fight at range. The laser sight really is effective if you plan on rushing or ambushing people, and it's commonly seen used with the Foregrip. The laser sight again does reduce the spread of the weapon quite considerably while doing absolutely nothing for the recoil. When used with the burst fire of the AN-94, then the gun becomes really accurate, and it is a bit more of a viable weapon to use when rushing or assaulting people. But again, if you're aiming down the sights, then the laser sight is a bit of a waste and it will give away your position. Although it's still used to dazzle or annoy people or teammates, so just be careful with that. The suppressor used to decrease the maximum damage a weapon was capable of doing, while also reducing the maximum range of the weapon at the same time. After the patch, however, the suppressor now only reduces the range while not reducing the damage at all. This might be good news for people fighting at longer ranges, although you will have to take the increased bullet drop into account, as your shots will lose their speed sooner. This change has made the suppressor more viable at both long and close ranges due to the damage remaining the same. There is of course a small hipfire penalty when the suppressor is equipped. This is different for each weapon, but when testing there did seem to be an increase in the hipfire spread even at reasonably close range. The patch notes state there's also a recoil reduction bonus when using the suppressor, but it's slightly less than the bonus granted by the flash suppressor. To be honest, I didn't really notice that much of a difference when testing. Another thing to note was that the aimed accuracy bonus has been reduced, and I noticed a tiny bit of extra spread while aiming down the sights using the AN-94. But when you're aiming down the sights, this increase in spread only becomes more apparent if you're at longer ranges. At close ranges it's not really that much of a problem. So overall, you might want to consider getting a bit closer to your target when using the suppressor with the AN-94. The main thing to take into account when using the suppressor is obviously the increased spread and the slightly reduced recoil. When using the AN-94 with the suppressor, I didn't really notice that much of a reduction in the recoil, although there was a noticeable increase in the spread. This would only really become more apparent at ranges, but you wouldn't really have that much of a problem if you do choose to fire carefully when using the suppressor. Also take into account the bullet drop as well, as that might affect how you play.